So I will share my screen here. In 1 second. All right. So the life of a training aid. The life of a training aid will have divided up into part 1 and part 2. Part 1, before this even gets to you, the life of a training aid, it's already had quite a bit of a life. So there's quite a few things that the training aid is particular to that training aid that we largely don't know about. This process is very much a black box. And so our training aids, whether it's narcotics or explosives, have a certain type of synthesis method. Oftentimes this method is not known to us. Actually, I don't think I've ever known the synthesis method of any of our training aids. And oftentimes they're different. The manufacturing process, that is often an unknown. And then there's this enormous black box outside of that as well, which is the age of the training aid, how it was stored and how long and under what conditions, and the packaging of it. And then the next step is that it has to get delivered to the primary customers. In the explosives industry, that's typically not the canine customer. That's oftentimes the explosives industry. And then delivery to the secondary customer, and sometimes that is the canine industry. So there's not much that we know, and there's very little we control about that part. In our explosives training aids, and this is also true with our narcotic training aids, they have a very different life as well. Oftentimes they are the product of drug seizures during criminal activity, and they've been in some sort of evidence locker for a long time, or have been in a lab being characterized for criminal trials. But in explosive training aids, they have a primary function, which is to go boom. And again, that canine customer is the secondary customer. So what are the issues with that? Well, the issues are that that composition of the explosive are all really geared towards explosion, detonation, etc. So the recipe is full of components that are designed to enhance that explosion, which the adversary is going to use as well. But when we look at what we're training on, those additives, those stabilizers, that manufacturing process, that synthesis recipe is very much an unknown to us. So we have a lot of questions in terms of what we're training on. And if there's that many variables, it only furthers the amount of questions that we have. Then there's that black box that we talked about, the age of the explosives, and that odor profile does change over time. When we talk about how the aids are stored, that odor profile changes as well. And it changes in relationship to how it's stored with other training aids or other explosives. And the fact that it can lead to cross-contamination if they're not stored properly, which if it's an explosive meant for the explosives industry, it doesn't matter what it's stored in combination with necessarily. But if it's an explosive for the canine industry, it does. How are the aids packaged? Poor packaging leaves the aids susceptible to light, sunlight, humidity, and other environmental odors. Again, canine industry considerations, not considerations for the primary customer. And then we end up with faulty material at the end of the day. We end up with material that we're not the primary customers for, and these training aids are not calibration level detection equipment. When we have our laboratory instrumentation, we have very precise training aids, or calibrants they're called, and they're very specific for calibrating our instruments, and everything's known about them. They are very well characterized. And then we have dogs that also need to be calibrated, and we pretty much throw anything at them and say, oh, okay, calibrate or perform this odor recognition test. And we're not really doing them any favors or giving them the respect they deserve by doing that with our dogs. So oftentimes I'll ask handlers, trainers, what have you, what are you training on? Or they'll say, oh yeah, my dog knows C4, or my dog knows, SB2, double base smokeless powder. And they'll sort of take it for granted. They'll say, yeah, my dog knows that odor. So we don't need to train on it, or, like it's sort of a given that, yeah, we're good with that. And so my assertion is that we're never good with any of our odors, that we should always be taking advantage of training with other agencies, cross-training, training with other people, because our odors are never really what we think they are. And here's a perfect example. If you ask for a safety data sheet, or what was formerly known as the MSDS, the material safety data sheet of double base smokeless powder, here is an example of what you will get from the manufacturer. You will get the CAS number, which is the number of the chemical compound, the percent weight, and then the name of the chemical. And so for double base smokeless powder here, they're saying it's 50 to 100% nitrocellulose and 0 to 42% nitroglycerin. So if you know anything about double base smokeless powder, you know that it has to have both nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin. But technically, based on that SDS, it could be 100% nitrocellulose, which would really be single base smokeless powder. So within the manufacturer's right, they could have given you 100% nitrocellulose and fulfilled the mandate of the SDS. Or they could have given you the compound on the right. All of those things could have been in that quote, that recipe of that training aid. And that's a wildly different training aid, or a wildly different double base smokeless powder. And so that can vary by brand, that can vary by batch, that can vary by a bunch of different things. So again, you want to take advantage of, without knowing what we have, and we're not going to necessarily change the explosives industry overnight, but in the meantime, the way we adapt is by cross-training and training with as many different training aids as possible. So when we ask what the right training aid is anyway, we get these questions a lot as well. We look at a threat list. We say, what do you want to detect? What is your adversary using? With drugs, that's what's relevant on the street. That may be different from locally versus border operations. So if we talk about, everyone will say, oh, fentanyl is a big issue right now. So if we talk locally, that would typically be fentanyl laced in heroin. If we talk to border operations, they're talking about 55-gallon drums worth of fentanyl. So very same drug, but different CONOPS, or concept of operations, with how they would approach that threat. If we talk about explosives, we want to see what's relevant in your area of operations. And those tend to differ by if you're in the continental United States, or if you're overseas. And those can be theater specific. So that'll be very different in the Middle East, or if you were in North Korea, or if you're domestically in the US. So in the US, we have a lot of homemade explosive threats. And then you would want to necessarily have a different training aid kit that's geared more towards the threat list that's pertinent or relevant in the US, if you have dogs that are here. And sometimes it's time dependent. We'll say that, we'll have a sort of a random explosive pop up out of nowhere. And it's just that's what the Terrys had access to that day, or they found a cache of something, and that's what they'll be using for the next couple of months until they run out of that cache. We want to assess the threat list periodically, And that's often a failure point that we don't do that. The DoD Military Working Dog Scent Kit is being reassessed now, but it had not been reassessed previously until 1972. So we need to be doing that more often. And then we need to be on the lookout for novel and emerging threats and how we characterize them. So we should be doing a toxicology and hazard analysis, making sure that whatever new threats that are coming out are safe to handle and store as a training aid. We should be doing that chemical analysis, figuring out what they actually are. And we should be characterizing the olfactory effects, making sure that some of these training aids are not having a negative effect on your dog's olfactory system. We also ask what the right training is anyway. So even once you've figured out, like theoretically on the threat list, it's relevant to your area of operations, it's non-toxic in limited exposure scenarios. So you know that you can train on this, and let's say it's HMTD explosive. And so our collaborator, Dr. Lauren DeGrief, wrote this wonderful journal article and did this really nice study on the variation that is present just with HMTD. And when we look at it, it's actually quite daunting to try and create a training aid just for this one explosive, because we try and figure out, okay, well, is it a matter of time? Because in the first 4 months of HMTD, after it's synthesized, it looks very different than in the second 4 months of its life. So in the first 4 months, it smells like formaldehyde, trimethylamine, and dimethylformamide. Irrelevant what those are, but there's very few odors in the headspace. And then in the second 4 months, it has a very distinctive fish-like odor that you can smell just by your human nose, which is predominated by formic acid. So 2 completely different smelling headspaces or odors that are coming off the same training aid as this HMTD ages over time. And then there's quality. The quality of the manufacture of the synthesis process will also affect the way HMTD ages and smells. We oftentimes think that there's going to be the lab grade, and then there's going to be the terrorist grade, and then they're going to be very different. But we also don't want to underestimate the adversary. Sometimes we find very, very clean, well-made or lab grade made explosives or drugs that are made in someone's home or in austere environments. The environmental conditions very much affect HMTD and some of our other training aids as well. And then one of the big things that affect our training aids are cross-contamination. So the MIT Lincoln Labs did a really nice study where they took energetics or training aids out of a police bunker, canine police bunker locally, and they looked for, in the headspace, the expected energetics. So that's what you would expect to find in the training aids that are listed there: ammonium dynamite, TNT, C4, smokeless powder, Detcord, and Semtex. And then they also published and or reported what they found as contaminant energetics on those training aids. And so you'll see that the C4 was contaminated with PETN and nitroglycerin. And that becomes an issue because C4, the expected energetic of RDX, has an extremely low vapor pressure. And the contaminant energetic of nitroglycerin has an extremely high vapor pressure. So you can surmise that the dogs from that unit, or the dogs that were training on that training aid kit, were not actually proficient on C4 or at all trained on RDX. If they were training on that training aid, they were really training on nitroglycerin. So this is another way that our training aids can undermine us if we're not careful with our storage and handling procedures. The second part of the life of a training aid is more in our control, thankfully, right? So this has to do with once the training aid comes to us, how can we control this process? What do we know about the best practices in terms of assembling our canine kits, storing them, handling them, and then doing right by the life cycle analysis of the shelf life, service life, and end of life of these training aids. So in our kit assembly, we want to be thinking about primary containment, secondary containment, and tertiary or quaternary containment and transport. And we want to think about the good, better, best dynamic. Good, we talk about good, better, best only because we know that in the laboratory, we can talk about the best case scenario all day long, but that's not necessarily going to be relevant for a canine unit that is strapped financially or that doesn't have access to all of the resources that we do in the lab. So don't drive yourself crazy about this. Just aim for good, better, best, and do as what you can. With primary containment, we are looking at a cotton scent bag, the metal sniffer tins. There's plastic flip top canisters, and then there's something that we invented for the U.S. military, which is the TAD, the training aid delivery device. In terms of secondary containment, those are typically metallized Mylar bags or glass jars. Sometimes people use plastic jars or Tupperware. And then tertiary containment often doubles as transport. And these are the Pelican cases, or also they can be Tupperware. So the TAD is what we are recommending and trying to move people over to in terms of primary containment, because out of the kit assembly and primary containments that were listed before, the scent bag, the sniffer tin, and the plastic flip top canisters are actually not actual containments because they are odor permeable no matter what. Whereas the TAD has components that when the lid on top can actually form a hermetic seal, meaning that you can actually shut off venting, and the TAD will be your odor delivery device and also can service primary containment of your training aid. So what you would do here is you would put the training aid into the glass jar or plastic jar, whatever you need. And then you would put on the membrane holder assembly, which is comprised of the membrane holder, the membrane, and the gasket. And you shut that training aid in there. And then that training aid will off gas into the environment. The TAD's membrane is what we call hydrophobic, so water repelling. So what that means is that, and the membrane is gas permeable. So what that means is that the odor of your training aid will be able to emanate freely, so come out of that TAD, but the training aid, the actual training aid, will not be able to. So that TAD allows you to maintain the integrity of your odor and of your training aid, and it allows you to put the TAD in all sorts of crazy training environments while keeping your training aid pristine. So you can bury the TAD, you can put it underwater, you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with it. And then at the end of your training day, you can completely wash down the outside of the TAD, clean it off, do whatever you need to, and then screw on the top of the lid, close it off. It's no longer off gassing, so it's not contaminating all of your other training aid odors. And then you can start fresh the next day. So there's a whole bunch of reasons to use TAD for containment. We're using them for hazardous material. We use them for COVID-19 detection dogs. We use them for liquids, so you can put clinical samples in there. We like putting materials in glass because it's one of the least reactive surfaces that we know. And we also like putting our training aids into something that's really clean to start off with. So when you put them in that glass jar, you're starting off with a clean start, and you're keeping that training aid as clean as can be from the get-go. We like using it for prevention of contaminating human scent onto our training aids. So we're not constantly associating human scent with our training aid. We don't have the loss of training aid substance due to environmental conditions. We did some studies with putting training aids into cotton scent bags and into metal sniffer tins. And every time we would place a cotton scent bag down on a surface, we were leaving behind particulate. We were leaving behind residual training aid onto that surface every time we put down the cotton scent bag. And so when we looked at total mass loss, we were losing our training aid all over the place. That creates a ton of issues training wise, because the next person that comes in and trains in your location doesn't know where you hid that training aid. You pull the dog off because you say, no, that's not where I hid that training aid. And really your dog's correct. So it's not a false alert, and you just really reinforce the wrong behavior because your dog was correct. Also, it's just not a good idea to do that and contaminate your entire training area. And then we'd also don't want to have scent cross-contamination where we're having our odors just sort of mixed with each other everywhere we're using these hide locations. So we have all sorts of different training aids that we can now put into these TADs, whether it's a liquid, a gel, really fine powders. We have fentanyl detection dogs that are able to train safely on those fentanyls now, or those synthetic opioids because of the TAD. And then we also can put them in really harsh environmental conditions as well. So comparison to current technology, there really is none, but we put it out there anyway. We developed the TAD so that it would have negligible background odor. So all of the materials of the TAD pass a NASA outgassing standard to be space grade technology and space grade low VOC, meaning that none of the components would outcompete your training aid for your dog's odor receptors. So we really wanted to make sure that we weren't using any materials that were really stinky and then would cause any issues for you in terms of proofing your dogs off of those contaminant odors. So when we look at considerations for kit assembly and packaging, there's two big ones, two big specs that come out, the MVTR and the OTR. So MVTR is moisture vapor transmission rate and OTR is oxygen transmission rate. First one's watertight and the second one's airtight. Watertight is the lower standard, airtight is the higher standard. You'll rarely see these published openly. You really have to dig for them, but those values will give you a good idea of how good your containment is. And that will, if they are published, that's usually a good sign. So you'll see those values on Pelican cases and another type of containments that are publishing those values. And the other considerations you want to have are the seal of any packaging that you're looking at. If that packaging has any odor itself. So you can have something that has a great MVTR and a great OTR, but it has also a lot of smell itself. So that's not going to work for a canine training aid. Cost is always one. So there's some great solutions out there, but they're really expensive. And then you also have to look at compatibility with your training aids. So there's packaging comparisons and trade-offs. I just wanted to put this here just so that I find a lot of people putting their training aids in Ziploc bags, and just wanted to show quickly that Ziploc bags have a horrible oxygen transmission rate. And so don't use them. Just bottom line, don't use them. The nylon arson bags that are oftentimes recommended, I also don't recommend. They also don't have a very good moisture, water vapor transmission rate or moisture vapor transmission rate. The best ones that you'll find are steel, aluminum, glass by far. And what we often recommend because of that, when we talk about steel, aluminum, glass, are the metallized bags. So that's going to be a plastic. So oftentimes they're mylar, but they will have a metal layer in between them. And that's a site where you can buy some for yourself. Arrangement of odors. Again, one of my favorite colleagues, Dr. Lauren DeGrief, says, don't let your odors talk to each other, and she means it, and it's a great expression. So you want that physical segregation, careful attention to co-location of odors, watch out for your high vapor pressure odors, only open one odor at a time, and you really want to limit that opportunity for cross-contamination. Quick chart of the explosive vapor pressures. So this will give you an idea of when we talk about the odors you want to watch out for. So things like nitromethane and nitroglycerin, really high vapor pressure odors, those are the ones that you're going to want to be very careful about where you open them and what else is around, because they will easily contaminate some of your other training aids. Storage conditions, we're finding out a lot about bunkers and RMAGs. They've really prioritized safety, security, and policy, but are horrible for preserving the integrity of your training aid odors. So they are just rife opportunities for cross-contamination because they get hot and they don't control odor at all. So it's just sort of baking all of your training aid odors together. Training aid storage. This is an example of some recommendations of putting the same 3 odors in a small Pelican case that are double contained, and then nesting the primary, secondary, and tertiary containment. Handling of training aids, gloves, glove changes. We oftentimes have a clean person and dirty person designated. We dictate the order of placement, where we place blanks first, then controls, then distractors, then targets, and that codifies the method of placement of our training aids. That way we don't unintentionally contaminate our hide locations or other training aids with the odor of target. And we pay very careful attention to what comes in contact with our training aid. Gloves, there's a couple glove recommendations there. So there have been a couple studies about using the lunch lady gloves that they'll so affectionately termed. The gloves on the top there, those HDP gloves, I don't recommend them. And that's because while they don't have a lot of odor themselves, when you cook with them, and you'll notice this, when you cook with them, your hands smell after you cook with them. So they do not have a very good odor barrier on them. So the gloves that we recommend the most are the nitrile gloves, except those are the most expensive. So in the good, better, best, you can do with that what you need to. HDP gloves are better than nothing. So that's good. And if you want to go to the best, you can have nitrile gloves. Shelf life and service life, they're defined differently depending on what industry you're in. Explosives industry, does it still go boom? Canine industry, does it still smell like what it needs to smell like? The service life is actually much shorter than we probably realize. And the different odors, we say we have different odors for different purposes: training, certifying, calibrating, etc. So what we do is we have a clean kit and a dirty kit. The clean kit is used for canine calibration, odor recognition testing, and certifications. That's stored under ideal conditions, room temperature or colder, and those odors are physically separated or segregated, packaged in multiple levels of containment, and we're very stringent with all of the methods that we use to handle and store that clean kit. And then the dirty kit is used in daily training. It may be old, it may be contaminated and degraded, but it can still go boom, so we do want to train on it. And then the way we cycle these kits through is clean kit, current kit, dirty kit, and then the next kit goes out for demolition, and then we cycle through. So that way the dogs are getting exposed to all sorts of ages and grades of either degradation, contaminated, or clean and dirty training aids. And then every so often, you want to make sure you calibrate your canine, not only with your own training aids, but other people's training aids, or even better, fresh material. And you can do this with a simple odor recognition test. We use scent wheels, and we make sure that you also have not just the target in there, but your distractors, blanks, and controls. And finally, these are the principles that we try to instill in everything that we do. We question everything, which is super annoying, but it does make us better at least knowing what our dogs are trained on and what they're not. And it does sort of make you challenge some of the basic assumptions of what our dogs are trained on. We are trying to preserve our odor integrity all the time. Again, that good, better, best storage and handling techniques, and trying to improve containment that is not so arduous in the field that you don't want to do it. We're doing blind training as much as possible, and we do scientifically valid certifications, meaning in our world is certification or validation is not valid unless you're using new material. You can't, certification is not valid if it's on your own training aids, because we know of how contaminated everything is. And then we vary training as much as possible by location, training aids, high and low vapor pressures, cohort, and then stress is a big one. That's another webinar all by itself. We asked everyone to show us the data, because there's in canine a lot of tribal knowledge, a lot of historical knowledge, a lot of anecdotal knowledge or data loosely. So we're very careful about taking any of that too seriously without actually going through the data. And then we say it takes a village, because we are all trying to help each other as we get better and better at what we do. And hopefully that makes our dogs better and better at what they do. So I will stop sharing and do any Q&A that comes up. If there are any questions.
Michele, I've got a question. My name's Alan Penn. I work for the New Zealand Defence Force. You talked about the TAD system and everything. Regarding TATP samples being placed into it, they still any sublimation from it?
Yes.
So there is still that risk of sublimation of that sample as part of the odor coming out through the membrane?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Andrew Maltz has a question, Michele.
Hey, Andrew.
Michele, g'day, how you doing?
Hi.
What can you tell us about odor evaporation rates and how that's impacted based on our containment choice?
So it depends on the training aid, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So for the most part, we haven't noticed any difference on the evaporation or permeation.
Well, the evaporation of the odor. And so if I understand the odor will degrade over time and the odor evaporates. So how can I minimize that based on the containment device choice and the system I use to contain the odor?
Right. So there's very little you can do to control that, other than when you're not using the training aid, just having the TAD lid closed.
And of course, that's also minimized by the material of choice. So in your case, say with a TAD, using glass, etc. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. We have in urea nitrate, and to lower the hazard class of urea nitrate in the U.S. for transport, we have to keep it wetted. And so we will have urea nitrate in the TAD wetted. And normally, if that was not in a TAD, that would have been dried out in no time, except inside the TAD, because the membrane is hydrophobic and we keep it sealed as much as possible when not in use. We've been able to have urea nitrate remain wetted for over 1.5 years.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Michele?
Yep.
May I add to that?
Yeah.
On preservation of odors. the headspace volume that you store if you minimize the headspace volume in the TAD, then you're going to preserve your odors a lot longer. I had TATP samples that I used for 2 years and had very little degradation or loss of product just because we minimized the headspace volume, stored in inorganics, and obviously kept them cool when possible.
Yeah, good point.
Michele, Jennifer Sewer, I think it is, has a question.
Yes, hi, Michele.
Hi.
I know you mentioned that the different good, better, best for containment containers. If you're using like a PVC, does the PVC off gas some smell into your source material, if that makes sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything off gases. It's just, it depends on how much and at what rate and what the source material is that would cause it to potentially off gas more or less.
Michele, Tori Jolly has another question as well.
Okay.
You were saying that there was the 3 levels of protection for the odor. Like level 1 is usually like the bags or whatever, and level 2 is like the Tupperware container, and level 3 would be the Pelican case. The TAD falls under the 2nd level, correct?
So the TAD actually is primary containment.
Okay, so with that being said, so say you have like PC powder or whatever, instead of putting it in a bag and then putting it in the TAD, you could just pour the PC powder directly into the TAD.
Exactly.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually what I would recommend. I wouldn't, because there's no point in having another containment inside the TAD, because then it's just another odor that you'd have to proof off of.
Michele, I've got one question that I've had come up a few times. This is Wayne. Reuse of the TAD. So either, breaking the seal and refilling or etc. What are the recommendations on that?
Not to do it. So I can only guarantee that the TAD will reseal properly, or will seal properly the first time you seal it. That's my guarantee, is that it will seal properly the first time, and that seal will be watertight, will be perfect the first time you do it. After you do it the subsequent times, I cannot guarantee that it's going to seal in that manner. However, we have lots of end users in the human remains and search and rescue end user community that have reused TADs and have reused them successfully. It's just that, and it can be done. It's just that I can't guarantee it. And so what happens is the gasket and the membrane, when you are reassembling it or twisting it on for the second or subsequent third, fourth, fifth time, oftentimes they'll twist on again perfectly, and you can keep on reusing it. There will come a time, however, when you twist it back on and the gasket and the membrane will not twist with the same amount of torque, and then that will cause the gasket and the membrane to pucker. And when that happens, you disrupt the seal of the TAD. And so then it no longer performs its function.
Awesome. Thank you, Michele.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer has another question for you, Michele.
Go for it.
So following up on the TAD, are you able to purchase just the gasket and the seal, so you don't have to buy the whole container?
No, because the the cost of the TAD is really is that whole top piece.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? I can show an example of containment. We have it nested here. So this is a TAD in a metallized odor barrier bag. And then it's in a secondary glass jar there. And then that fits into a Pelican 1150 case. And so you can put that in there, or you can put that in a larger transport case if you want several of them. So this is 4 levels of containment. This is a lot. This is beyond best if you want to do it that way, or you can do it a little bit more practically in an 1120 case, and then have just the TADs in a metallized odor barrier bag in here, just like that. Lots of options that you can do to have your best practice, get your best practices in, and still make it easy enough to go train.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Michele. That was an awesome presentation, lots of information. And I will now introduce into our next host, which is Mr. Todd Wilber from Precision Explosives. And again, thanks, Michele.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Todd, are you there?
I'm here. Can you see and hear me?
Yeah, we can.
All right, I'm going to do a screen share as well. This is a presentation, kind of our standard presentation. I'm going to skip through some of these slides pretty quickly. My particular area is explosives. A little bit about myself. Sorry, that's a typo. Actually, it's not supposed to say all-around badass. It's supposed to say all-around fat ass. I'm a former U.S. military bomb technician. Done explosives research in 2 of our national laboratories, as well as at New Mexico Tech, where I'm still an adjunct professor there. I've been deployed multiple times, both as a military bomb technician as well as a contractor. And I'm going to share a little bit about explosives. And as I said, we're going to go through some of these things quickly, because it does a deeper dive in explosives when we're going to talk about training aids. Have an explosives canine handler, because it's going to give you an idea of the quantities that you could potentially see. And we break explosives down. Those are the actual bombs. We break explosives down into 3 different categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary. What's important to know about that is that it tells you what the sensitivity is and kind of what the idea of the quantities that you can see. The primary explosive is going to be one like this, what's found in a blasting cap, and those explosives are going to be very sensitive. And you will generally not find them in large quantities. Secondary explosives, which require primary explosive, like a blasting cap, to go off, can be found in virtually any quantity. A tertiary explosive, think about something like for mining or quarry blasting, that kind of stuff. Those are going to be very large quantities. They're going to be highly insensitive, and they require a secondary to work. The moral of the story is you can't take a blasting cap and put it in a blasting agent and get it to go off. It's just not going to work. It has to be sensitized. So we can think about these things. If people are concerned about, is it going to blow up? If my dog hits this, is it going to blow up? If you see a large quantity of an explosive, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be sensitive enough for your dog to do anything that will hurt you or hurt the dog. Lastly, there are binaries. Binaries can be anywhere on that spectrum, because I can mix two things together, like for example, Armstrong's mixture, and it is extremely sensitive. Little snap pop things, that's what Armstrong's mixture is, or had a cap gun. So those are very sensitive. TATP, HMTD obviously are very sensitive, but all the rest of them, not so much. This is actually an example of what I was just talking about, and that is Armstrong's mixture. I encountered this for the first time working on an IED in Afghanistan, and I'd like to bring this particular explosive up because I don't want first responders to encounter Armstrong's mixture the first time when they're responding to it, or they're responding to an incident. Armstrong's mixture can be made by simply crushing up match heads and then scraping off the red striker that's on the side. You mix those two very carefully together, and they are very impact sensitive. In this particular case, there was a commercial non-electric blasting cap that had been made into an electric blasting cap using Armstrong's mixture as well as a small appliance light. And yes, that will be sufficient to make it go. One of my moments of extreme stupidity, I decided it was a good idea to try to figure out how they're putting these blasting caps together. What I encountered was Armstrong's mixture. Here we have another improvised blasting cap. This one is using a Christmas tree light along with TATP. Put the two together, tape it up, and attach it to an electrical charge, and that's what you get. Now, if that had been put in some other heavy confinement and also more material, that would suffice as a blasting cap. Commercial electric blast or non-electric blasting caps in Afghanistan are a dime a dozen. They come from Pakistan and they're easy to get a hold of, and then they convert them into commercial, or convert them into electric blasting caps. And here's a picture of some blasting caps where they did exactly that. On the right side, we have commercial electric caps, and then on the left side we have some that have been converted using again an Armstrong's mixture and a small appliance light. Here's a seizure. This was 7.5 tons of homemade explosives, and we had a variety of different mixtures. This particular one, and this factory sealed can, was ammonium nitrate and automatic transmission fluid, of all things. Then we had some potassium chlorate with corn oil. This is potassium chlorate with corn meal in the right ratios, and if it's been ground up properly, yes, that'll go as well. We have ammonium nitrate. These particular devices were intended to be put on vehicles, either to try to do something sensational or to distract the driver and steal their cargo. Here are some ammonium nitrate prills with diesel fuel. And here's another example of magnetically attached devices. This is a couple of containers from IEDs that I worked on, and they have two different types of aluminum powder. it's really important to understand how valuable just the minute details that you as the first person to discover this, how you can influence subsequent actions. We have aluminum powder made from we have ammonium nitrate and an aluminum paste that's used to make metallic car paint. And then on the right side, we have ground up ammonium nitrate with a different type of aluminum powder, and they both work really well. Here's a close-up view of the paste. That actually would work better if it were ground up. The one that was on the right was actually the most clever BB idea I've ever encountered, and that was 2 of these jugs in the trunk of the car with commercial electric blasting caps, appliance wire hooked into the car's speakers. So the device function just simply by turning on the stereo. We'll go through this. This is a suicide vest. And so what happens when you put them all together, you have some type of initiator that goes to the blasting cap. Then you have secondary explosives, and that may be all you encounter. And then lastly, you have to have a tertiary. We talked about Armstrong's mixture, and we're going to skip through this and go to what's most relevant to you. What is your dog actually smelling? So we're going to talk about the explosives. Michele brought up some really good points about things that are in explosives and things that we need to be aware of. For example, C4. C4 has very little RDX. The numbers of things that are also in C4, like for example, the tagnant, and then also a reclamation solvent that's used to make RDX. We find that the RDX amount is a very small minority. When we start talking about vapor pressures and parts per billions and quadrillion and all that kind of stuff, that makes my head hurt. So I came up with a different way to try to explain the amount of odor that your dog is actually being exposed to. So it made all those numbers positive. And if you look at RDX in the middle, that's only 485. If you look at DMNB, which is the taggant, it's 207,000. If you look at cyclohexanone, which is the solvent that's used to make RDX, but it is very present in C4, it's 666 billion, 600 million. And we've done tests where we put out both cyclohexanone and RDX. The RDX was closer to the dog. The dog will shoot past the RDX and go straight to the cyclohexanone if the dog has been imprinted just on C4 and does not run on pure RDX. It's a very important thing to take into account is what are you imprinting your dogs? What odor are you imprinting your dogs on? The same thing can be said for PETN. PETN oftentimes is sourced from det cord or from sheet explosives. There is a chemical that is used to help keep those materials pliable. It's in vinyl tubing. So if you go to a hardware store and pick up just regular vinyl tubing, if the dog was imprinted on PETN that came from det cord or sheet explosives, the dog will definitely be interested in vinyl tubing and may actually indicate. We recently did, I won't say recently, I guess it was last spring, we went to a conference and we had access to casino spaces and dogs were alerting to the beer taps. And the reason why they were alerting to the beer taps is because of all the vinyl tubing is going to them. And about half the dogs showed a tremendous amount of interest and one went to final. And it was all based on the fact that their training aid for PETN was going to be something like det cord or sheet explosives. Let's talk a little bit about peroxide-based explosives. We get questions all the time about, well, can I run my dog on acetone and hydrogen peroxide? Is that going to be the same thing? No, it is not the same thing. And here's why. Unlike other binary mixtures that I mentioned before, chemistry actually takes place when you are making peroxide-based explosives. The same thing for urea nitrate. We encountered a trainer who had a bag of prills labeled urea nitrate, and we had to help him understand that urea prills are not the same thing as urea nitrate. you have to bake a cake. With a binary, I can sift out the components or separate the components. It's its own new critter. So it's important to understand that peroxides and urea nitrate, they are not binaries. They are their own molecule. We also think about the efficiency of what is it that your dog actually needs to focus on, because man, you can run on so many different things like Simtex H, Simtex 1A, C4, sheet explosives, on and on and on, Comp B3. All those things have the same constituent explosives in it. They're just in different ratios. So for example, Simtex B3 things are going to have PTN or RDX or TNT or some combination thereof. So if you focus on just those three for the military and some commercial explosives, it really helps you out. It also helps the dog to understand exactly what they're supposed to be looking for. We also get asked sometimes about HMX. Why not put HMX on that list? HMX is a contaminant. All RDX has HMX in some percentage. When we get our explosives, when we get our RDX from the manufacturer, they have a lab analysis that tells us what the percentage of HMX is. So that's an important point to understand, is that those three, as long as your dog is training on those three, you're covering all the other ones, all the other explosives that you see there on those bubbles. Michele talked about smokeless powder. As she said, it's going to have nitrocellulose in it, and it'll have either one of two other energetic materials, and that'll either be DNT, that's a skinny sister to TNT, or it'll have nitroglycerin. And so what we try to help people with is, we have two different smokeless powder formulations that essentially all others are going to fall in between these two. One is a very high concentration of DNT, and the other one has a very high concentration of nitroglycerin, obviously with the presence of nitrocellulose as well. All black powder has potassium nitrate in it. And so what we focus on is pure potassium nitrate as a training aid, and dogs do extremely well with these. And lastly, you have things like commercial explosives, and they're going to be things like, it may have nitroglycerin, ammonium nitrate, EGDN, but essentially they're going to have one of those two cornerstones. By the way, if anybody's interested in this particular slide, we can get that out to you. We often get requests for that. How to store, the do's and don'ts. I'm going to repeat some of what Michele had said. Wear gloves, use a clean surface, metal or glass containers. Why metal or glass containers? They are inorganic. Inorganics will not allow organics to pass through them. Pop sacks and other plastic bags, those plastic, believe it or not, is inorganic. And because of that, over time, it will allow those odors to penetrate through it. Use the smallest possible container, and I'm going to touch on that here in a minute. Don't touch your explosives you're adding to the odor. And don't reuse your scent tins without cleaning them very thoroughly, obviously. Don't store in plastic or arson bags. And then don't overfill your scent tins. This kind of explains, gives you a visual representation of what I was talking about. Organic storage containers versus inorganic storage containers. Can't pass through it. So think about glass, metallized mylar bags. The example I like to use is, think about how pickles are stored in a metal lid. You don't put it in a plastic bag because everything else is going to smell like pickles over time. Here's an example of a different way of doing that, using quart paint cans, or I guess it'd be 1 liter paint cans for those of you who are smart enough to use the metric system. And vapor pressure is a very important thing to think about. Vapor pressure is going to push against things. If you think about what happens when you have a bottle of Coca-Cola. If you open up the lid, you're going to get that little sound, and then you pour some out. The Coke then has to off gas. It will off gas and refill that headspace volume vapor pressure. When it gets to equilibrium, it can't off gas anymore. So that's an important thing to think about in terms of how you store your odors and also how you place your odors, is the headspace above whatever your target material is. Here's Michele had all the great numbers. Numbers confuse me sometimes, so we came up with a graphic that kind of gives relative vapor pressures. Notice HMX is on the bottom. Most people say Her Majesty's explosives, but actually HMX stands for high molecular weight RDX. It's a fat sister to RDX. Your dog really can't tell the difference. Same thing with Tetra and TNT. They're so close in the way that the molecules are structured that we've seen dogs that have only been imprinted on TNT. We put Tetra out, dogs hit it right off the bat. Notice what is absent from this chart, and that is HMTD. HMTD, we don't know what its vapor pressure is, because every time somebody tries to measure it, it blows up in the machine. Very volatile stuff. Should you fill your scent tins to the top? Absolutely not. And the reason is you have to have some kind of headspace volume there to allow the odor to escape. So you need to have some air void between where the top of your material is to the top of the container. And this is an example of what we're talking about. Basically, it's just an air void above the lid of your container. I did some original research on TATP and HMTD out at New Mexico Tech, and we made a number of different variations of TATP and HMTD. When I say variations, we use different acids as catalysts and watched them sublimate away. So we were very concerned that we'd just lose all the material. So we had to be very careful and cognizant of the fact that if we put them in the proper storage container and then minimize the headspace, in other words, we use the smallest possible container, then we're able to keep the product for a couple of years, which was phenomenal. Here's an example of one of the our product, and that is the odor print. And the odor print is it's metallized, it's cellulose that has been infused with actual material. So when I say infused, it's not a soak. We don't put it in the presence of explosives. It has real explosives, real oxidizers, real propellants, all that kind of stuff in it. And then it's put between two aluminum discs and riveted together. The key thing about the way it's constructed is we don't touch anything with our hands. Everything was with a gloved hand in the entire process. We don't put any inks, dyes, adhesives, anything like that on the odor print, and that's why we use the rivets and then stamp in the material that stamp in the name of whatever the material is. I'm going to go off of share screen for a minute and show you some other examples. I'll get out of that. Wayne, how do I get out of share screen?
Escape.
Yeah, it should be up the top. There should be like a red button that says stop sharing.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, can you all see me now as opposed to
Yes.
everything else?
Yep.
All right. So here's an example of what I was talking about with the metallized mylar. Like what Michelle was talking about, we use 2 bags. So what we can do is we can take odor print with this little rare earth magnet on it and put it inside a smaller bag, and then put both of those inside a larger bag. And in essence, we're doing the same thing that Michelle was talking about. We also make a version of the odor print that goes in the TAD. So you would actually have real odor infused in cellulose and then placed inside the TAD. And the advantage to this is that sometimes getting real odor is a difficult thing to do. So this gives you the ability to do that. We'll load the odor in the cellulose material and then put it in a TAD. And you don't have to have any special security, special transportation, or anything like that. Any questions?
Tori Jolly has a question, Todd.
Okay.
Hi. So I have 2 of them currently, like your odor prints, and I've been using them decently frequently or whatever, but I was just curious on 2 things. One, how long roughly do they last, like before you need to get a new one? And the other question is about how much, like if you were to calculate how much weight, if I were to need to put in a weight for it, how much odor do you believe it throws off?
Those are great questions. To answer your first question is we recommend changing out between 6 months and a year. We've had odor prints that have lasted 18 months before you see any appreciable loss. But the reason why we suggest 6 months to a year is you're probably adding to the odor. So to get back to that purest possible form, that's what we recommend. And as Michelle said before, you got to use gloves when you place on. That will really help. As far as a weight equivalency, we believe that based on the surface area, that it's somewhere between 1/3 of a pound and 1/2 a pound. And one of the big things we focus on with the odor print is the surface area. So the actual amount of material that's there is pretty small, but because of the surface area, that's what is actually contributing to such a large scent picture. So, or amount of available odor. The use of the magnet gives you the ability to either have both sides exposed or only one side if it's face down. Also, we have recently made a smaller version. It's about half the size, and those will be available very, very soon. Some people have had issues, not just with odor prints, but they'll say, well, when I first got these things, my dog's done really well. And then, so I got some new odors, and the dogs just don't seem to respond as well to the new odors. And most of the time it's because the people are handling their odors with bare hands. So the dogs are starting to indicate on their trainer as opposed to the new training aid. Did I answer that for you?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Yes,
Todd,
ma'am.
would you mind touching on thresholds and surface area?
Thresholds and surface area. Surface area is more important than the weight, because really it's only the top thinnest possible layer of that odor that's actually off-gassing. So if you focus more on surface area and less on weight, then you're going to probably get more out of your training aids, regardless of what the training aid is. If you think about, if you open up a bottle of vinegar, not much odor is escaping through that small orifice. Pour it out on the floor. Now it's a tremendous amount of odor, even though there isn't that much material that's on the floor. So it's important to think about the surface area and adjusting your thresholds. I'm going to toss this to Michele because Michele, you talk about kind of a continuum of adjusting thresholds for small amounts, medium amounts versus large hides.
Yeah, so what is the question?
Well, she was talking about thresholds, and there's a point that you made at some point when we were talking about the dog has to be exposed to various thresholds to really be effective at that odor, because the scent picture changes as the amount of available odor is there.
Yeah, and that depends on the training aid, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need different training aids. What it means is that you can alter that by changing the soak time and by changing the hide location or the hide containment. And so that could look like putting it in a drawer and letting that drawer soak for hours. Or that could look like putting a training aid out in the open and having no soak time at all. And so that's how you would vary the perceived amount of odor that your dog would be encountering.
And you had a question a minute ago, Michele?
Yeah. Do you have any plans on branching out from explosives to other training aids, Todd?
We do. We're right now in the testing phase for narcotics, and we're looking at a couple of different ways of doing that. One is, our tried and true odor print method of using real narcotics. The problem with that is you have to have a license for that. That isn't always a problem for other people. We are looking at a different technology that simply captures the odor as opposed to, and then releases it over time, as opposed to actual, having possession of real material that can test positive for the presence of drugs. But we're testing that out and looking at its longevity. And ideally what we would do is take that new technology that absorbs the odor, like the analogy that I heard somebody use that really made sense to me is when you make popcorn, you smell the popcorn, but you don't have the room filled with popcorn. So that's kind of what this replicates. And then we would put these in TADs.
Cool. That'd be great.
Any other questions?
I've got one, Todd. It's Wayne. I think we spoke recently about odor degradation and how it can change the odor over time. I think we're discussing a certain explosive, and after a certain amount of time, it doesn't smell the same anymore.
Exactly. And Michele alluded to that with HMTD, but it's not exclusive to HMTD. TNT, of all things, actually will degrade over time. One of the slides that I blew through was a block of Russian TNT, and it was very reddish. The Russians make TNT that is only TNT. Western countries will often make TNT that has a very significant percentage of its skinny isomer called 2,4 and 2,6 DNT. So you have 2,4 DNT, 2,6 DNT, and then TNT. Those two isomers have a much higher vapor pressure. And so sometimes people say, my dog's having a hard time with TNT. A lot of that has to do with the age of your training aid. And so it could be that your dog was imprinted on newer or older, and then that kind of stuck with them. So TNT evolves over time. It's very important to understand. Any other questions?
Yeah, lastly, pure odor. Now, this is a massive debate, as you know, but if we can just talk about pure odor.
We believe that pure odor sends a much clearer indication to, or gives the dog a very clear idea of what you're asking them to find and identify. Now, I'd invite Michele to add to this. That doesn't mean that that's all you work your dog on. You have to complicate it and make sure that the dog understands that this is exactly what I'm looking for, and can pick that component out. We have another product that we're bringing Lauren to Grief Silk into this again, called the mixed odor delivery device. And the mixed odor delivery device looks like this. And it is, you can take the two halves apart. It has multiple chambers on the inside. You can load your target odor, distractors, whatever you want. Put that back together, and then you can adjust the amount of available odor by adjusting this restrictor plug on the top. As a result, you can make a complex scent picture, include that pure odor as well. Also, your dog doesn't come in contact with the odor. And here we go. You can put basically anything you want in there. But we have a kit that includes all the fuel and oxidizers. It's almost an infinite number of possibilities, but we have hydrogen peroxide, potassium chlorate, ammonium nitrate, and then a number of different fuels and a recipe book that goes along with it. And you'll get little vials like these. These are for narcotics. And then you put your odors in there and test your dog, make sure that it's working on finding all the right stuff. Did you want to add to that, Michele?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, that you need to train on the base odor of whatever drug or explosive is the target, but then you also need to complicate that scent picture for your dogs, either in the presence of distractors or in the context of mixtures. And so you do want to have, you need to teach your dog what is productive. And so if you only show your dog one productive scent picture, they will become little robots and they will only find that one thing. And so that is why you do want to, help your dogs generalize to all of those different mixtures as well. And so that's a great way to accomplish that.
There's been a few questions of where to get these products, so I'll just jump in. So for the TADs and the restrictors and etc., they're at Sky Canine, which is scicanine.com. Thank you, Michele. And for the precision explosive equipment, you can go to pre-exp.com for all of their products. And if you're in the Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, etc., you can go to tacticscanine.com.
And thank you, Wayne, for hosting us.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you guys for being available. I hope everyone's got enough information out of that to sit back for a little while and think about where they're going to train and what they're going to train. If there's no more questions, I think we'll leave it here.
Super. Yeah, feel free to reach out anytime with questions.
All right. And this recording will go up in the next 48 hours for people to be able to view and refer back to.
Super.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for attending.